All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to today's Red Hill Rediscovered. My name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the Director of Historic Preservation and Collections here at Red Hill. And I'm really excited to introduce my friend and compatriot, Dr. John Ragosta, who'll be talking today on the interesting relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. Now, Dr. Ragosta is a historian, lawyer, and beekeeper living in Charlottesville, Virginia. He's currently a historian and a fellow at Virginia Humanities and serves on the Research Advisory Council here at Patrick Henry's Red Hill. He's taught history and law at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, Hamilton, Oberlin, and Randolph Colleges. And I'm sure really enjoys caring to his bees up in Charlottesville, which is such a cool thing. I've always been jealous of. But as Dr. Ragosta speaks today, everyone with their questions, please feel free to put them into the comment section or the chat box, and they'll be answered at the end. So with that, Dr. Ragosta, I will leave it to you.
Cody, thanks so much. And you too can become a beekeeper. We'll have that conversation some other time.
Sounds good.
But let's go ahead and get started today, because we want to talk about two men, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. And these two individuals were great leaders of the American Revolution and in the early Republic, but they led in very different ways. And when we talk about Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, one of the things that is immediately striking is how different our historic memory is of these two individuals. Most Americans have heard of Patrick Henry. And I realize for a group from Red Hill, this will not be the case. But for most Americans, if they know anything about Patrick Henry, it's 7 words that he spoke at St. John's in March of 1775, "Give me liberty or give me death." But in fact, Patrick Henry is far more important than that memory. In the 19th century, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson become known as the trumpet and the pen of the American Revolution. It was understood that they were great leaders. And Thomas Jefferson says of Patrick Henry that he gave the first impulse to the ball of revolution. Jefferson says it's not now easy to say what we would have done without Patrick Henry. Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General of the United States, talks about Patrick Henry awakening the genius of our country and binding a band of patriots together. So Henry is very important, and yet there's this imbalance in our historical memory. People certainly know a lot about Thomas Jefferson, but very little about Patrick Henry. And what I want to suggest is that that difference in our historic memory owes a lot to the relationship of Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. So I was giving some thought to how I could explain all of this, and I couldn't come up with anything better than simply walking through chronologically their relationship and how they got to know each other, and then talk about that a little bit. And what we see is 4 distinct phases. In their early relationship, Patrick Henry is really Thomas Jefferson's idol. And then over time, they have a falling out. Jefferson refers to it as a wound on my spirit, a very dramatic statement of how upset he was with Patrick Henry. And then later, we have Henry's final political campaign, which Jefferson again refers to as apostasy. That's a religious term, apostasy, someone who's betrayed the true religion. And then finally, because Henry dies in 1799 and Thomas Jefferson's going to live until 1826, we have this period after Henry's death, and which that historic memory and that relationship between Jefferson and Henry really is established. So let's just start walking through chronologically how they get to know each other and how they interact over time. Well, we're going to start with Henry being Jefferson's idol. And they first meet at a Christmas party at this gentleman's home. This is Nathaniel Dandridge. He's a plantation owner in Hanover County. And it's 1759, the Christmas season, and the two men meet there. Now, Patrick Henry is already 23. He already has several children at home. He's already failed at several businesses. He sort of failed as a plantation owner. He fails as a merchant in keeping a store. And Thomas Jefferson, who's a very young man, he's 16, he is just beginning to start his formal education. He's going to be going to William and Mary for his education. And they meet at this Christmas party. Now, after the fact, many years later, someone writes that Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry played violin together at this Christmas party. Well, that's a lovely story. It's really probably apocryphal. It probably doesn't happen. Thomas Jefferson is still very young. He's going to learn much more about the violin while he's at William and Mary. If anyone played fiddle at that party, it was undoubtedly Patrick Henry. He's very popular with his neighbors. He's a very outgoing man. And to make a little digression from the Henry Jefferson story, what's always fascinated me about that is if Patrick Henry is playing fiddle at this Christmas party, listening somewhere around a corner, possibly sitting on a store or maybe on her father's lap, is a young Dorothea Dandridge, who is either 2 or 4. We don't really know her exact age. And she, 17 years later, is going to become Patrick Henry's second wife. Well, Henry and Jefferson do meet each other, and they apparently like each other. They become friends, but they're next going to see each other 4 months later in April 1760, when Patrick Henry goes to Williamsburg to try to get a law license. And he meets again a young Thomas Jefferson. Now, you have to excuse me. I couldn't find a portrait of a young Patrick Henry. We have an older Patrick Henry. But Henry goes to get his law license, and he's done something a little bit different. Most people in 18th century Virginia, if they want to get a law license, they become a clerk, basically an apprentice to an established lawyer. Henry, having failed at several businesses, a young man in a hurry, he has several children at home, he reads the law. And this is going to become an issue between Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. This is an image of one of Patrick Henry's law books. And by the way, Red Hill played a part in getting this law book preserved. But Patrick Henry has read the law. He's read a certain number of legal textbooks, and he's going to Williamsburg to try to convince a committee of learned lawyers that he's ready to become a lawyer. Now, we don't really know exactly how long Patrick Henry studied the law. The estimates vary anywhere from 1 month to 9 months. And even 9 months is a very short period to read the law. But apparently, Patrick Henry tells Thomas Jefferson that he had only studied for 6 weeks. And this annoys Thomas Jefferson no end, because Thomas Jefferson is going to study the law under George Wythe for many, many years. And years later, he's still talking about Patrick Henry only studied the law for 6 weeks, and he was incompetent, and he doesn't know anything about the law, of course, all of which is ridiculous. I've always wondered whether Patrick Henry was really just pulling his leg. Patrick Henry has a reputation as a young man of playing practical jokes. I can imagine over a bowl of punch or over a couple of ales in one of the local Williamsburg taverns, Patrick Henry says, "Oh, yes, I only studied for 6 weeks." But it's going to become an issue because it rankles with Thomas Jefferson. Well, they next come across each other a few years later when Patrick Henry is a rising star in the House of Burgesses. And he rises on May 29, 1765, his birthday, by the way, to make one of his most famous speeches. And Thomas Jefferson, this is a few years later, is in the audience. He's studying law in Williamsburg with George Wythe, and he's crowded into the House of Burgesses to listen to the speeches about the Stamp Act. Now, Americans didn't like the Stamp Act, but it appeared that they were going to accept it. Benjamin Franklin says, "We don't like it, but I guess we have to live with it." And Patrick Henry rises to make this very famous speech where he says, "We cannot abide by the Stamp Act." And he warns the king. He says, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles II had his Cromwell, both of those men being assassinated by their opponents, and George III, and people were screaming treason, treason, because he's basically saying the king's going to be assassinated. And Henry quickly diverts and says, may he learn from their example. Now, historians have often questioned that story, whether that's really what Patrick Henry said. And this is an image from the 19th century. The previous image is really what the House of Burgesses looked like. But interestingly, Thomas Jefferson says years later, I remember it very clearly of Patrick Henry diverting and making that statement that George III can learn from their example. So in this period, Thomas Jefferson is very much taken by Patrick Henry. He's older, he's a leader in the House of Burgesses. Jefferson, actually referring to that Caesar had his Brutus speech, says Patrick Henry, it seemed to me, spoke as Homer wrote. This is very high praise coming from Patrick Henry. Well, time goes on, and they meet again a few years later after the Intolerable Acts are adopted. Now, we remember that the Boston Tea Party occurs in 1773. Britain responds by adopting the Intolerable Acts that is going to close the port of Boston. It's going to suspend parts of the Boston, Massachusetts Charter. It's going to allow for trials of British officials outside of Massachusetts, outside of America, the so-called Intolerable Acts, and it's really leading up to the American Revolution. Well, Thomas Jefferson has been elected to the House of Burgesses. He's elected in 1769. So with Patrick Henry, he is a young leader in the House of Burgesses. And they form a little bit of a group. Some of the young members, Patrick Henry, Richard Bland, George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, we might say the squad of their era. These are young progressives. But for this group, Patrick Henry is clearly the leader. George Mason says Patrick Henry is the principal of the group. Well, one of the things they do in response to the Intolerable Acts is this young group of radicals suggests that the House of Burgesses should adopt a proposal that everyone should have a period of fasting and prayer. Everyone should go to Bruton Parish Church on June 1st, the day that the Boston port was scheduled to be closed, and we will pray that our country will be safe from these attacks on our liberty. Jefferson later says that this motion was cooked up. But this is an example of how they're cooperating, and Patrick Henry's the leader. They're also going to cooperate on the committees of correspondence. Jefferson later suggests that that was his idea, but clearly Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, they're involved in creating this committee of correspondence. Then 1 year later, once the Continental Congress is formed in response to these British actions, Thomas Jefferson is going to take it upon himself to draft a summary view of the rights of British North America. Now, again, let's think about the context. The Continental Congress has been formed, and Thomas Jefferson is not elected as a member. George Washington, Patrick Henry, George Wythe, these are all members. Peyton Randolph, Benjamin Harrison, these are people sent to Philadelphia to represent Virginia. And Patrick Henry is among them. Patrick Henry was actually the greatest vote getter for being a delegate to the Continental Congress. But Thomas Jefferson, who's always had a little bit of an ego, decides that he's going to draft some instructions, some draft instructions for Virginia's delegation to the Continental Congress. And he calls it a summary view of the rights of British America. Now, he plans to take this to Williamsburg before the delegation goes to Philadelphia. But he gets ill. And instead, he asks his enslaved manservant, Jupiter, to take 2 copies. He's made 2 copies of these instructions, and to take them to Williamsburg, and to give 1 copy to Peyton Randolph, who's the, excuse me, who's the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, and give the 2nd copy to Patrick Henry, because he knows that Patrick Henry is going to lead the delegation in terms of being strong to protect American rights. Now, many years later, Thomas Jefferson talks about that 2nd copy, because what happens is Peyton Randolph gets the summary view of the rights of British America, And he apparently shows it to other people in the House of Burgesses, and they decide it's too strong, it's too radical. Thomas Jefferson suggests that Parliament has no authority in America. Thomas Jefferson is really pushing the king. And they decide not to use this summary view. But what happened to the second copy? What happened to Patrick Henry's copy? Now, years later, after they have a falling out, and we're going to get to the falling out, Thomas Jefferson says, well, Patrick Henry was useless. He says he apparently communicated it to no one. He writes that whether Mr. Henry disapproved the ground taken or was too lazy to read it, for he was the laziest man in reading I ever knew, I never learnt. He says that no more was ever heard of it. Patrick Henry probably thought it too bold for Virginia in 1775. More recent scholarship, particularly by John Kukla, who of course has had a great involvement with Patrick Henry and Red Hill, John Kukla shows that apparently what Patrick Henry did with his copy of the summary view was he took it to Clementina Rind, a publisher, a printer there in Williamsburg, and had it printed so it could be distributed. Because we know, and this is an image of one of those printings, we know that the printed copy of Thomas Jefferson's summary view was available in Philadelphia when the Continental Congress met. Patrick Henry and George Washington apparently take copies with them to Philadelphia. In fact, it turns out that it was partially because of that summary view and because the delegates to the Continental Congress were so impressed by Thomas Jefferson standing up to the king, Thomas Jefferson standing up to Parliament. His summary view is going to play a critical role in Thomas Jefferson's being appointed to the Committee of Five that ultimately drafts the Declaration of Independence. So in fact, Thomas Jefferson is appointed to the committee and writes the Declaration of Independence because Patrick Henry took that second copy of the summary view, which Jefferson says he forgot, he didn't read, he was too lazy, but Henry takes it to a printer and has it printed and spread around. So this initial period, this ends this first period of Thomas Jefferson being idolizing Patrick Henry. And it moves us into a second period in which there's going to be a falling out between Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. Now, in the second period, this begins in 1776 when Patrick Henry becomes the first governor of the new state of Virginia. And of course, he's residing in the governor's palace in Virginia, and he serves as governor for 3 years. And during that 3 years, Thomas Jefferson apparently has no complaints about Patrick Henry as governor. After Patrick Henry is dead, Thomas Jefferson will allege that Patrick Henry wanted to become a dictator in this period. In fact, the evidence of that is just not there. There's really no significant evidence of that. But during the time, Thomas Jefferson has no complaints about Patrick Henry as governor. Henry serves his 3 terms, which is the maximum permitted under the 1776 Constitution. And the second governor of Virginia is Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson's a little bit unlucky as governor because while Thomas Jefferson is governor, the state is invaded. And much worse, it's invaded by Benedict Arnold at the head of Redcoats. And we know that Benedict Arnold's Redcoats are going to chase the government of Virginia out of Richmond, and they go from Richmond to Charlottesville. And then Benedict Arnold is going to send Banastre Tarleton to try to capture the government in Charlottesville. And by the way, Banastre Tarleton is almost as bad from the colony's perspective as Benedict Arnold. He's referred to as Bloody Ban. In fact, after the war, to give you some indication of the type of person and type of fighter that Banastre Tarleton was, he apparently said after the war, while he was a member of the Parliament, that no man in America had killed more men or ravished more women than he had. So Banastre Tarleton is not a nice guy. And he's bringing the Redcoats to Charlottesville to try to get the government of Virginia and the governor, Thomas Jefferson, who is staying at his home at Monticello. Now, in fact, Thomas Jefferson's governorship, his second term is expiring. His second term is up. But Virginia has not yet adopted a new governor. They have not appointed somebody else. Jefferson writes, the Speaker of the General Assembly, and he says, look, I know I'm eligible. Don't make me governor again. You need to appoint somebody with military experience. There's redcoats all over Virginia. We need to fight. But the government has not yet appointed a new governor when Banastre Tarleton approaches Charlottesville. And again, those in Charlottesville will be familiar with the famous story. Jack Jewett, the Paul Revere of Virginia, finds out that Tarleton's coming. He races to Monticello. He races to Charlottesville, and the government flees from Charlottesville to Staunton, Virginia. But Thomas Jefferson, whose term has expired, instead of fleeing with the government to Staunton, he flees with his family down to Lynchburg, his home at Poplar Forest. And so when the government reconvenes in Staunton, Virginia, over Afton Mountain, it appears that the governor has abandoned the state. And the first thing that the government does in Staunton is they do appoint a new governor, Thomas Nelson Jr. He is a man with military experience as well as governmental experience. And in fact, interestingly enough, Thomas Nelson Jr., until the Civil War, is the only governor who ever led the troops of his state in battle, because he leads the troops from Virginia in battle at Yorktown. But the second thing that the House of General Assembly does, the Virginia General Assembly does, is the House of Delegates and the Senate, is they launch an investigation of Thomas Jefferson. The implication is that he's abandoned the state, that he's a coward, he has dishonored himself, he has dishonored the state, and he's a failed governor. Now, history has been somewhat ambivalent on whether or not Thomas Jefferson was really the target of Patrick Henry, or whether someone other than Patrick Henry was launching this investigation. As I said, historians differ. I actually think Patrick Henry was probably behind it. Jefferson wouldn't make that accusation without having heard from some of his allies in Staunton. But at one level, it doesn't really matter whether Patrick Henry was behind it. Thomas Jefferson believes that Patrick Henry was behind it. Thomas Jefferson later writes James Monroe that the mere investigation has inflicted a wound on my spirit which will only be healed by the all-healing grave. I mean, even for Thomas Jefferson, this is over the top. And this is really where they fall out. After the Battle of Yorktown, after Virginia is successful, it's clear we're going to win the war, America is successful, George Washington is going to win the war, the General Assembly thinks better of the investigation, they dismiss the investigation, and they unanimously vote Thomas Jefferson thanks for his service as governor. The high opinion which they entertain of Mr. Jefferson's ability. But it doesn't heal the wound. The wound will only be healed with the all-healing grave. And this is really where Jefferson and Henry have a falling out. Well, and then there's one other incident that occurs that's worth mentioning, is we know that we're going to have the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. Now, I don't want to talk about that at length because Thomas Jefferson's not here. Thomas Jefferson is serving as minister to France. But it is interesting that investigation of Thomas Jefferson occurs in 1781. He writes Monroe in 1782 that it's a wound in my spirit that will only be healed by the all-healing grave. By 1788, when we are trying to decide whether to ratify the U.S. Constitution, and James Madison, the father of the Constitution, is very concerned that Thomas Jefferson, the minister of France, may not support this new Constitution. And interestingly, he writes Thomas Jefferson. James Madison's a very smart guy, and he knows Thomas Jefferson very well. He writes Thomas Jefferson that, you know, I think Patrick Henry is going to oppose ratification of the Constitution. Now, we know that, in fact, Patrick Henry does oppose ratification. But Madison writes that in September of 1787, right after the Philadelphia Convention finishes with the Constitution. Henry really had not made up his mind yet, but Madison knows that Jefferson is so upset with Patrick Henry that the best way to get Thomas Jefferson to support the Constitution is to say that Patrick Henry's on the other side. And so he writes Jefferson, and he says that I had taken it for granted from a variety of circumstances that he, Henry, would be in opposition, and I think that will be the case. Okay, so this leads us to the third period. Again, reminder, there's this period when they meet, when Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry are the young bucks in the House of Burgesses and then in the General Assembly, and Patrick Henry is his idol. There's then this period in the Revolution where they're governors, and they have this falling out over the investigation of Thomas Jefferson's governorship and his apparent desertion of the government. And we come to this third period of Henry's final campaign and his so-called apostasy. Well, Patrick Henry had gone into retirement after the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. He retires from the General Assembly in 1791. And the country's going to have a lot of attention in the 1790s, a lot of partisan fights. And we know that one of the critical ones by 1798 is going to be the Alien and Sedition Act. This is a copy of the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act literally makes it illegal to criticize the President of the United States or the U.S. Congress. Now, by the way, I always tell people, you can say whatever you want about the vice president. Vice President's Thomas Jefferson. But this act, which we would certainly understand as being unconstitutional today, it's a violation of the First Amendment, free speech protection, but it makes it illegal to criticize the government. And Thomas Jefferson is outraged. People are being thrown in jail because they're criticizing the government. Thomas Jefferson refers to it as a reign of witches. And he drafts the Kentucky resolutions. Now, the Kentucky resolutions are really a radical states' rights document. The Kentucky resolutions say that any individual state may nullify a federal law with which it disagrees because the United States is a mere compact of independent sovereign states. And therefore, Kentucky may declare that the federal law is null, void, of no force or effect. In Virginia, the Virginia resolutions are adopted. They're drafted by James Madison. They're much milder, but they do say that the United States is a mere compact of independent sovereign states. The problem with that is if it's a mere compact of independent states, succession is possible and civil war threatens. In fact, Thomas Jefferson is talking about succession in 1799. Determined were we to be disappointed in this, repeal of the Alien and Sedition Act, that we to sever ourselves from that union we so much value. In fact, Virginia is buying arms to arm its militia. One Virginia militia officer is quoted in the newspaper as saying that if France invades, because there was a concern that Napoleonic France might invade as part of the European wars, if France invades, I will take my troops to the French banner rather than to the stars and stripes carried by a political enemy. Newspapers across the country were reporting a threat of civil war, talking about a suspicion that a coalition for succeeding from the Union existed between Virginia and Kentucky. George Washington writes to Patrick Henry in retirement and begs Patrick Henry to come out of retirement. And Patrick Henry finally does agree to come out of retirement at George Washington's behest to defend the Constitution that he had opposed as the leading anti-federalist. And he makes his final political speech on March 4th, 1799, at Charlotte Courthouse in Virginia. And Thomas Jefferson refers to that as apostasy, because Patrick Henry is going to defend that Constitution that he had opposed. And Patrick Henry is going to defend the federal government against Jefferson's radical states' rights. Now, Henry, in fact, reminds people at that Charlotte courthouse speech that he had opposed the Constitution, that he had warned them the federal government would become too powerful, too distant from the people. The federal government will interfere with your rights. But he says, we agreed, we the people. I didn't agree with it, I voted against it. But we the people agreed to this Constitution, and we must live within it. He ends his speech by saying, if we do not live with the Constitution, you may bid adieu forever to representative government. You can never exchange the present government but for a monarchy. And in response, Thomas Jefferson, still at odds with Patrick Henry after that wound on my spirit, accuses Patrick Henry of apostasy. Well, after the Charlotte courthouse speech, Patrick Henry dies a few months later. He dies on June 6, 1799, a mere 3 months later. Had Patrick Henry lived, it's almost certainly the case that Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected president. So this is very interesting. What should we make of all of this? Peter Onuf, the great Jefferson scholar, points out that, in fact, Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry politically, if you look at their political beliefs and their arguments, they're actually very, very close. But we need to remember that the founders were just people. They sometimes had feet of clay. They sometimes fought each other. And in this case, there's this enormous personal political battle. And after all, no one ever falls further in our memories than the idols of our youth. Patrick Henry had been Thomas Jefferson's idol. They had worked together. They then have the falling out, a wound on my spirit. And then in this final political campaign, which almost prevents Thomas Jefferson from becoming president, Thomas Jefferson accuses Patrick Henry of apostasy. And that leads us then to this fourth period after Patrick Henry's death, because Thomas Jefferson's going to live for an additional 27 years. And in that period, he's going to have a huge influence on Patrick Henry's memory. Jefferson says many things about Patrick Henry as time goes on. He refers to him as being all tongue, without either head or heart. He says what we have to do is devoutly pray for his death. He says he's avaricious and rotten-hearted. He says he read nothing and had no books. He wrote almost nothing. He could not write. In his heart, he preferred low society. You may recall the reference earlier. He says he's a lazy reader. He's lazy. He didn't read anything. He didn't do anything with that draft of the Summary Review of the Rights of British North America. His legal reasoning is not worth a copper. He wanted personal courage. This is getting Henry back a little bit for that 1781 investigation. His two great passions are the love of money and of fame. George Wythe, the great legal scholar of 18th century Virginia, absolutely refused to sign his law license. And perhaps worst of all, he says that Patrick Henry had contempt and hatred for George Washington. So for 27 years after Patrick Henry is dead, Thomas Jefferson is going to take that wound on his spirit and that 1799 apostasy, and he's going to stew on it and stew on it, and he's going to find every opportunity to poke at Patrick Henry. In fact, a number of these comments are made in 1823 and 1824 when a young Daniel Webster and then later a young Martin Van Buren visit Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, and he's asked about the founders. Can you tell me about the founders? And he goes on and on about Patrick Henry being incompetent, being lazy, not being able to read. He's a coward. And he says these things over and over again. Now, mind you, many of these things are complete fabrications. For example, we know that, in fact, Patrick Henry's law license is signed by George Wythe. Somebody finds a copy in one of the county's records sometime in the middle of the 20th century. We know that the idea that he had contempt and hatred for George Washington, the fact that George Washington writes Patrick Henry and begs him to come out of retirement, and Patrick Henry, who had always refused to come out of retirement, writes back and says, I have to do it because you, the father of my country, asked me to do this. The idea that his legal reasoning was no good, these are ridiculous statements, but this is the kind of animosity that has been generated between Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson is going to do everything he can to propagate the idea that Patrick Henry, while a great speaker, Thomas Jefferson agrees to that, and while he got the ball of revolution rolling, everything after that is he's incompetent, he's a bad lawyer, he's a demagogue, he was trying to be a dictator. And this has an impact over time because it's not just Jefferson who starts repeating these things about Patrick Henry. It's also Jeffersonians, those who support Jefferson. So, in fact, after Jefferson makes these statements, the Aurora, which is the great Jeffersonian newspaper in Philadelphia, at that time, we may recall that newspapers tended to be Federalist or Democratic Republican. The Aurora is the great Democratic Republican newspaper, the great Jeffersonian newspaper. In January of 1799, when President John Adams suggests that he's going to appoint Patrick Henry as an ambassador to France to try to reach a peace treaty with France, the Aurora reports that Patrick Henry is venerable, his reputation is alike pure, and his talents conspicuous. After that March speech, when Patrick Henry challenges Thomas Jefferson's radical states' rights and the Kentucky resolutions, the Aurora prints a new article. He says that Patrick Henry is in the insuspicious temper of second childhood. It has made him a dupe. He drag his aged limbs and break his wind. He farts. The Aurora is telling fart jokes about Patrick Henry because Patrick Henry had the audacity to challenge Thomas Jefferson. And this carries on down through history. So, for example, this is an image of Edward Pollard. Edward Pollard is an unrepentant Confederate after the Civil War. And he's the one who writes the famous book, or infamous book, The Lost Cause, which insists that the Civil War was not really about slavery, but it was only about states' rights. He loves Jefferson because of those Kentucky resolutions, saying that a state may declare a federal law null and void, a state may secede from the Union. And he hates Patrick Henry because Patrick Henry had the audacity to stand up to Thomas Jefferson. So Pollard writes in the 1870s that Patrick Henry was a terrible politician, a terrible statesman, a bad lawyer, and he wasn't even a very good speaker. He really wasn't a very good orator. Now, this is absurd. Everyone who ever heard Patrick Henry speak, including Thomas Jefferson, including Edmund Randolph, including John Marshall, say that he's one of the greatest orators of all times. But Edward Pollard says no, he wasn't even a very good speaker, allowing that Jeffersonian attack on Henry to ferment. And this has also impacted historians over time. Kevin Hayes, who writes a very good book about Patrick Henry's intellectual life, but he has been infected by the Thomas Jefferson distrust and attacks on Patrick Henry. So when he quotes Thomas Jefferson about that Caesar had his Brutus speech, when Thomas Jefferson says, Patrick Henry seemed to me to speak as Homer wrote, Hayes says, well, maybe that was really a backhanded compliment because Thomas Jefferson, being a very educated man, was distinguishing Homer, who was a demagogue, from Demosthenes, who was a great speaker, but also a great statesman, a great lawyer. This is absurd. There's a different time where Thomas Jefferson directly says that Patrick Henry must have been superior to Demosthenes and Mirabeau. So, we're making up excuses to try to suggest that Patrick Henry is not a great lawyer, a great statesman. Other historians have done the same thing. Don Higginbotham says that at the Continental Congress, Patrick Henry was way outside of his league. He was out of his element and he knew it. He bases that upon what Thomas Jefferson says. Norman Rischards repeats the idea that George Washington and Patrick Henry didn't get along. Kevin Gutzman says that Patrick Henry's 1799 campaign against Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry's 1799 campaign against Thomas Jefferson is a puzzle. You can't explain it. But in fact, it's very well explained that Patrick Henry was saying, we agreed to the Constitution, we must live within the Constitution. So these are the issues which I discuss in my book, Patrick, For the People, for the Country, and in a recent article in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. Well, I'm coming to my end. I've been talking for a long time. I'm going to be interested in your questions. We've left some time for questions. But there's always an important question that they ask you when you're in history graduate school. And that is the question, so what? So what? I've been going on and on now for 40 minutes about how Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry got along and then they didn't get along. What does any of this matter to us today or to our study of history? Well, I think there's several things we can take from this. The one is it's very important to remember, because it's so easy to forget, that the founders are not marble statues. They are not these demigods. They're real people. And they sometimes fought with each other and they sometimes disliked each other. And as Peter Onuf says, Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, in fact, share very similar political views. But because of that 1781 investigation, they're very much at loggerheads. They're very much political enemies. Second, so what? I think that it's important to remember that history occurs, but it's also written. We've often heard the story that history is written by the victors. It's also written by those people who live. So one of the great historians, Gordon Wood, talks about it's very important to outlive your opponents. Well, Patrick Henry doesn't have that privilege, and Thomas Jefferson outlives him by 27 years and writes this history. So history is not only lived, but it's written, and we have to always be aware of that and to be asking ourselves questions about who wrote this history and is there something going on there. And my final so what? Let's go back to that very beginning. I won't flick back through the slides, but to Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, these two great revolutionaries, the pen of the American Revolution and the trumpet of the American Revolution. Thank you. But we remember Thomas Jefferson, and so many Americans have forgotten Patrick Henry. And he really deserves better. He in fact played a critical role. He not only got the ball of revolution going, he then becomes the leading anti-federalist, is a critical role in getting the Bill of Rights adopted. He plays a critical role in the early development of the country, a critical role in defending Virginia and the nation during the American Revolution. And it's telling that in 1799, when George Washington is concerned that the nation is on the brink of civil war because of those Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, he writes one man and asks that man to come out of retirement to save the country because we're on the verge of civil war. And that man, of course, is Patrick Henry. So with that, I've been talking a long time, and I'll be interested in any questions that you all have.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John. Wonderful talk as always. And we do have a lot of great questions coming in, so we'll get right to it here.
Right.
The first one, did Henry say malicious things about Jefferson during his life?
I'm glad you asked that. It's a very good question. And I realized I was running out of time, so I left it off. The simple answer is no, or at least not much. This feud is really propagated by Jefferson. Henry does give Jefferson an elbow now and again. The worst thing he apparently says, and he apparently mentions this in that March 4th, 1799 speech, and he mentions it a couple times. He said he had no notion of a man's abjuring his native victuals. Well, what he's doing is he's poking fun at Thomas Jefferson, because when Jefferson comes back from France, he has a French cook. And so he's sort of poking fun at him. You know, he doesn't even trust Virginian cooking anymore. How can you trust this man? But Henry's not really feuding with Jefferson in the same way that Jefferson is feuding with Henry. I will say there's something else that's interesting that happens at that time. And I'll see if I can find my notes. There it is. In 1785, Patrick Henry is again governor. And he seems to realize that they've fallen out, and he seems to realize it may have been a little bit his fault because of that investigation in 1781. Thomas Jefferson is minister to France, and Henry, as governor, has official business with the minister to France because they're trying to get that Houdon bust of, or that statue of George Washington for the Virginia Capitol. And he's communicating with Thomas Jefferson, trying to get him to get this great marble statue of George Washington. And he writes one letter with that business in it, and then he sends a second letter with it. And he says, gee, Tom, we used to be good friends. We haven't talked in a long time. We're communicating now in official capacity, but I'll also include a letter now and again telling you what's going on here in Virginia. We're both farmers. We're interested in that. Let me tell you what's happening to the crops. I'll tell you about this and that. And you write me back about what's going on in Paris. And, we'll communicate like friends. Jefferson ignores the letter. Jefferson does not respond. Now, in the mid-1790s, there's turnaround. Thomas Jefferson tries to make peace with Patrick Henry. He writes to Archibald Stuart, who is one of Thomas Jefferson's law students, but also a friend of Patrick Henry, and he says, I hope you will satisfy him, Henry, if you please, that there is no remain of disagreeable sentiment towards him, Patrick Henry, on my part. And Jefferson's trying to make up with Patrick Henry. And some historians say, well, see, okay, they're both feuding, they're both trying to make up, and Henry ignores that effort by Thomas Jefferson to try to make peace. These two things are not equivalent. Mm-hmm. Patrick Henry, in governor in 1785, has no ulterior motives. There's no reason for him to be writing Thomas Jefferson other than to try to make peace. In 1795, Thomas Jefferson is very concerned that the Federalists are appealing to Patrick Henry. George Washington is asking Patrick Henry to join the Federalist administration, first as Secretary of State, then as Supreme Court Justice. And the Jeffersonians are very worried about what Patrick Henry is going to do. And this exchange between Jefferson and Archibald Stuart is all in the context of we've got to prevent Patrick Henry from aiding our political enemies, the Federalists. So that's a long answer to your question. Yeah, Patrick Henry pokes at Jefferson now and again, but not nearly the way that Thomas Jefferson goes after Patrick Henry.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, John. We've got another one coming in here. This is from Samuel. What would you say Henry's greatest political vices were, even if they were not the ones which Jefferson over-exaggerated?
Well, first, it's a good question, and thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't mention slavery, certainly. And both Tom, and again, this is Harry, Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, from my perspective, are very similar on slavery. They both own, among them, hundreds of enslaved workers. Thomas Jefferson owns over 600. Patrick Henry owns over 100. And they both have very similar views about slavery. They both say it's wrong, it's an abomination, it must stop. They both write against it, but neither of them frees a significant number of slaves. Thomas Jefferson frees a few Hemmings family members. Patrick Henry tells his second wife in his will that if she wants to, she could free a few slaves. And in fact, Patrick Henry is asked by an abolitionist, by the Pleasants, Robert Pleasants, he's a Quaker, about slavery. And can't you come out and say something publicly that will help us eliminate this abomination? And Patrick Henry writes an amazing letter. This is early on in the 1770s. Remarkable letter. And he says, you're right. It's wrong. It's an evil. How can I say I'm a Christian and yet I have slaves? It's a clear violation of everything in the Bible. But I can't live with the inconvenience of living without them, is basically what he says, which, I mean, even to repeat it, it's just terrible. Thomas Jefferson has too much smarts to put that in writing. But it seems to me he's doing exactly the same thing. He knows it's an abomination. He knows it must end. But, it's just too inconvenient, too problematic to eliminate it. So certainly slavery is a problem. To go beyond that, Henry is much more of a speaker. He's much more of a common man than Jefferson is. And that's good and bad. Jefferson, Madison, John Adams, George Washington. These are people who keep meticulous records, who are very, very careful about, we're going to do this and then this. They consult with other allies, with mentors and mentees. Henry is a little bit more off the cuff, so to speak. And that's a great strength in the courtroom. He's one of the greatest trial lawyers of all time because he's just so good. He comes up with ideas. He has the jury in tears, and then he has the jury laughing, and then he has them aghast. And it's all because he's very extemporaneous. And as a historian, I certainly wish that there was a lot more recorded by Patrick Henry, a lot more care taken. But I think probably the same was true at his time. And so take a lot of those criticisms of Jefferson. With criticisms, Jefferson's not stupid. He's a very smart man. There's oftentimes a grain of truth. Does Patrick Henry have Thomas Jefferson's books? No, of course not. Does he read like Thomas Jefferson? No, of course not. Does he write like Thomas Jefferson? No. And so I do think he could have been a much more careful politician and lawyer, and a much more careful statesman, and recorded a lot more.
Yeah, well said, especially for us at Red Hill or any Henry sites. We wish he wrote more down just so we know when he did when.
Now, by the way, some of that's related. It's interesting, and I point this out in the book, that almost all of the major founders in the last 50 years, last 60 years, there has been from the National Archives a papers project where we're going to gather up all of the letters they wrote, all of the letters written to them, all of the memos they wrote, and we're going to record those and collate them for historians. There have been a major papers project for Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Edmund Pendleton. I mean, all of these leaders, of the revolutionary leaders, Patrick Henry is by far the most important, for whom there's been no major papers project. And I think to some extent that's because Henry has not been appreciated because of what Thomas Jefferson and others have done to him. Mm-hmm. Now, even if there was a papers project, Thomas Jefferson, there's going to be over 70 volumes. We're not going to have 70 volumes of Patrick Henry papers. Right. But if somebody really did the work of gathering all that material together, there'd be 5, 6, 7, 8 volumes of Patrick Henry documents, which would be very useful. If anybody listening wants to put up several $1 million, we could launch a Patrick Henry Papers project, but it just hasn't been done to date.
Mm-hmm. Well, and part of what you said there, John, about Jefferson kind of being involved in Henry's legacy ties in with what Karis asked here. She asked, rather than a falling out, isn't it more accurate to say that after 1781, Jefferson determined to discredit Patrick Henry? And she does mention the quote you said from James Ellison, our former director, where Jefferson was abjuring his native victuals.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, Karis. That's a fair characterization. Maybe I was trying to be kind. And, the wound on my spirit, I mean, think about that statement. I mean, even for Jefferson, who writes these very florid things, these very emotional things, it's a wound on my spirit, which will only be healed with the all-healing grave. And it becomes true. He doesn't let it go until he's dead. And then it continues by Jeffersonians after he's dead. So yeah, Thomas Jefferson really takes after Patrick Henry. And the historians quibble a little bit about why, but to me, it's this 1781 investigation very clearly that wound on my spirit quote. Put yourself in Jefferson's shoes for a moment to understand why is he so bitter? Why does he, you are correct that he tries to discredit Henry. He had been governor. He had been fighting. Governor under the 1776 Constitution was not an easy job because you had very limited power. Benedict Arnold invades. He sends Bannister Tarleton to try to, run you out of Charlottesville. Jefferson knows that he's not the right man for the job. He says, get someone else. And then they launch an investigation accusing him of cowardice, accusing him of incompetence, accusing him of dishonor, which for an 18th century gentleman, this is attacking his character. You might remember Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address, which at the very end, he talks about, look, I'll make many mistakes, but they'll never be mistakes of the heart. I'll make mistakes because I don't do the right thing, because I don't see the right thing, because I don't understand the right thing, but I'll always be trying to do the best for America and for the American people. I'm paraphrasing the language. And so this was an attack on Jefferson that implied he abandoned the state. And yeah, it launches him into, what is it, 45 years of attacking Patrick Henry. When I first wrote the article for the Virginia magazine that was published, I originally titled it, "Why Does Thomas Jefferson Hate Patrick Henry?" And various editors said, you can't say that. You can't say Thomas Jefferson hated Patrick Henry. I said, yeah, but he did. And this is important to that point I was making about they're not marble statues. And I should have mentioned this as an example. We hear a lot these days about Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's become popular. He's got a new musical. And we're told that they're enemies somehow. Very different. Thomas Jefferson understands that his disagreement with Alexander Hamilton is political. And he fights Alexander Hamilton. He disagrees with him vehemently, but he understands its politics. And he never doubts that Alexander Hamilton was in his own way trying to do what was good for the country. In fact, Jefferson writes in his Annus, which is this book he's keeping of the founding of the early republic, and he's keeping notes. And someone tells him, in the 1790s, when we were afraid that the country was going to fall apart and Britain was going to grab a few states and France would grab a few states, I heard, and this is sort of malicious rumor, I heard that Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris were promised by Britain that if the country fell apart, they would get a sinecure, they would get a job in Britain. Britain would take care of them and give them basically lifetime money. Jefferson, in the 18 teens, drops a footnote in his notes, and he says, impossible as to Alexander Hamilton, he was far above that. Okay, so Hamilton and Jefferson have political disagreements, but Jefferson understands that that's political. The disagreement with Henry is personal, and it's a personal insult. It's an insult to his honor, and he never lets it go. So yeah, he does everything he can to discredit Patrick Henry.
Well, that really is unfortunate, and who knows what history would have been like if they stayed friends. But unfortunately, John, we're coming right up on the hour here. But I apologize to all the folks who we missed questions from. But please join us next month for another Red Hill Rediscovered. And again, John, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.